He endured. He held up. He was able to hang in there. He didn't faint.
For nearly 5 decades, Pastor Charles Stanley preached unwavering faith and family values to millions across the world. But in the quiet corners of his own home, far from the pulpit and cameras, his world was unraveling. His wife filed for divorce. His son walked away from his ministry. His daughter stood watching as the family collapsed. Now, after his passing in 2023, his family is finally speaking up. And what they've revealed about his final days paints a much more complicated picture of the man so many considered a spiritual rock. The last 3 words Charles Stanley ever spoke to his son would forever change how the world remembers him. Charles Stanley was born on September 25, 1932, in Dry Fork, Virginia, during the Great Depression, when bread lines stretched for blocks and families struggled just to survive. His parents, Charlie and Rebecca, were poor but proud. Just 9 months into Charles's life, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly at only 29 years old. One day he was there, the next, gone. No memories, no goodbyes, only silence raised. By a single mother during the hardest economic crisis in U.S. history, Charles was deeply shaped by that early abandonment. It left him with a hole in his heart and a spiritual hunger for a father who would never leave. When Charles was just 9 years old, his mother remarried, hoping to provide her son a father figure. But instead of healing, it brought terror. His stepfather, John Hall, was an alcoholic with a violent temper. Charles would often lock his bedroom door at night, even keeping a loaded gun under his bed in fear. This constant fear shaped his belief that God alone was worthy of trust. While others broke promises, God never did. That message would later define his ministry in his darkest moments. Charles would flee to the church basement and pray, crying, shouting, begging for peace. That Pentecostal fire never left him, even when he later became a Baptist preacher at 17. Charles visited his grandfather, a preacher himself. Charles didn't feel strong enough to lead, but his grandfather told him, "If God tells you to put your head through a brick wall, you run at it full speed. It's his job to make the hole." That one sentence defined Charles Stanley's life. Obey God and leave the consequences to him. From small-town churches to national platforms, Stanley's rise was steady. He preached, taught, studied Greek and Hebrew, and built deep connections with working-class congregations. In 1971, after intense church conflict and even physical altercations, he became senior pastor at First Baptist Atlanta. In 1978, his TV show In Touch launched on CBN within a week. He went from 16,000 Atlanta viewers to homes across America. Soon, he was in 150 countries and 127 languages. Stanley wasn't just a preacher, he was a media pioneer. He created solar-powered audio devices called messenger labs, distributing them in villages without power. His sermons were broadcast across the globe, but fame brought friction. In 1984, he became president of the Southern Baptist Convention. During its most heated theological battle over whether the Bible was without error in every sense, even scientific, Charles stood firm, but it divided the denomination. At home, things were no easier. Behind the camera lights, his marriage had crumbled. After years of tension, his wife filed for divorce in 2000. The news shocked the evangelical world. Stanley had preached family values his whole life. Now he was the face of a broken home. His son, Andy Stanley, also a pastor, quietly stepped away from his father's ministry. Though both continued to serve in Atlanta, their paths diverged. The relational strain was clear. For years, neither man spoke publicly about the rift. But insiders say the tension between them wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. In the final months of his life, Charles Stanley had become quiet. Frail, often tired, he spent more time alone. He was still writing, still praying, but his fire had dimmed. Andy Stanley, his son, later revealed something heartbreaking in a private memorial. As Charles lay in his final hours, barely responsive, Andy visited one last time. For a moment, his father stirred, opened his eyes, and whispered 3 final words. That simple sentence held decades of pain. pride and unresolved conflict. It was both a release and a blessing, not just from father to son, but from pastor to the millions who'd watched him live a very public life, with very private wounds. After his passing in April 2023, Andy Stanley and his sister Becky shared that their father was not perfect, but he was genuine. He believed in grace. He wrestled with regret, and in the end, he let go of pride to choose peace. Today, In Touch Ministries continues his work. His sermons still air across the world. His books are still read. And his final words remind us that, no matter how public a life may be, the quiet moments at the end reveal the true heart of a man. Charles Stanley passed away on April 18, 2023. At the age of 90, quietly in his sleep. There were no dramatic headlines, no fanfare. Just the soft silence that often follows a giant's final breath. But the waves he left behind were immense. Within hours, tributes began pouring in from pastors, politicians, celebrities, and everyday people across the globe. Social media was flooded with memories, testimonies from addicts who found healing, marriages saved by his sermons, and lonely souls who felt seen for the first time through a TV screen. But amid all this public remembrance, the most personal reflections came from his children, Andy and Becky Stanley, both of whom had, in their own ways, lived in the long shadow of their father's legacy. Andy, who leads North Point Community Church, one of the largest churches in America, broke his usual silence on their relationship. In a heartfelt tribute, he said, "Dad taught me how to preach, yes. But more than that, he taught me that obedience to God matters more than applause from people." Becky, who had often stayed out of the public eye, wrote a letter read at his memorial. In it, she said, "He wasn't perfect, he struggled. But in his struggle, he leaned harder on Jesus. That's what made him who he was." Even after his passing, In Touch Ministries continues with the momentum he built over decades. His sermons are still broadcast on TV, radio, podcasts, and YouTube, reaching millions of people in over 100 countries. His teaching style, simple, scripture-based, and emotionally resonant, continues to set him apart. He didn't try to impress with academic theology. Instead, he used clear language, personal stories, and a calm voice to speak into broken hearts. His phrase, "Obey God and leave all the consequences to Him," became a life principle for many. Some of the solar-powered messenger lab devices he championed are still being handed out in remote parts of the world, villages with no electricity. In Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of South America, still hear his voice, preaching the gospel in their language. To this day, more than 1.5 million of these devices have been distributed, and his printed devotionals are mailed to hundreds of thousands of subscribers monthly. Charles Stanley's life reminds us that greatness doesn't come from being flawless. It comes from faithfulness through flaws. He had moments of anger. He had moments of control. He made decisions that hurt people, including his own family, but he also kept showing up. He kept preaching. He kept seeking forgiveness and offering it. The story of his last words, "I forgive you," will forever remain one of the most powerful images of a father who could finally let go. Not just for his son's sake, but for his own peace. In many ways, Charles Stanley's real sermon wasn't on TV. It wasn't from behind a pulpit. It was in how he lived, fell, stood back up, and finished his race. His family now says he left with no enemies. Just love, memories, and unfinished prayers. Charles Stanley didn't rise to national fame overnight. His journey was long and often painful. In 1966, he began his ministry journey from a small school in Miami. But it was in 1971 that things really started to change. At First Baptist Atlanta, he faced opposition from inside the church. Some people didn't want him as their leader. Tensions escalated to the point of a physical altercation, something almost unheard of in a church setting. But Charles didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down on his commitment to his beliefs and vision. By the 1980s, he had turned conflict into momentum. Through TV and radio, his sermons reached millions of homes across America. In 1984, he became president of the Southern Baptist Convention, winning with just 52% of the vote a close race. but a victory nonetheless. He helped lead the convention through a major theological shift, making it more conservative. Charles Stanley was no longer just a preacher. He had become a powerful figure in American Christianity. Yet even as he built an empire of faith, problems at home were beginning to surface. In 1988, Charles Stanley reached a new height in his public career. He was inducted into the National Religious Broadcasters Hall of Fame. His sermons were being broadcast to more than 115 million homes. His program, In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley, had become a household name. While his message was reaching further than ever, his family life was suffering in silence. In 1989, while in a hotel room for a ministry rally in Kansas City, Charles had what he described as a spiritual vision. He looked out the window, saw dozens of satellite dishes, and felt God telling him this would be the way to spread the gospel worldwide. From there, his ministry grew rapidly, reaching over 4,000 networks in 127 languages. But his wife Anna felt left behind, she once said. He chose his priorities, and I have not been one of them. She wasn't bitter, just heartbroken. By the early 90s, she stopped attending his church. Their son Andy saw it all happen. The silence, the distance, and the slow breakdown of a marriage that had lasted nearly 40 years. Eventually, Anna filed for divorce. Though she used the initials A.J. Stanley, it was clear who she was. The man known for preaching family values now faced a very public crisis in his own home. The news of the divorce rocked the evangelical world. Charles Stanley, the man who stood so strongly for marriage and family values, was now facing the end of his own. Some pastors turned against him, calling for his resignation. Even though Anna briefly withdrew her divorce petition in hopes of reconciliation, she refiled it in 1995. The Stanleys lived in limbo, married legally, but emotionally distant for 7 painful years. During this time, some Christian radio stations stopped airing his sermons. Some of his church staff resigned. Even his own son Andy chose to step away from First Baptist Atlanta. Yet, Charles refused to step down. He had once said that if he ever got divorced, he would leave the ministry. But when it finally happened, he stayed in the pulpit. When the divorce was finalized in May 2000, Charles was 67. His ministry still reached millions, but at home, he stood alone. Church bylaws said he could remain pastor as long as he didn't remarry, and he never did. He told his congregation, "God has assured me I'm where He wants me to be," and surprisingly, they agreed. The church board voted overwhelmingly to keep him as pastor. But to many, his words revealed something deeper. He said, "I never felt like I really even divorced her. She asked for it, I responded." To some, it was denial. To others, it was heartbreak for years. Charles and his son Andy barely spoke. Andy left the church he was supposed to inherit and started his own in 1995, North Point Community Church. It wasn't just a new location, it was a different philosophy altogether. Andy said, "Atlanta doesn't need another church. It needs a safe space for the unchurched." That comment was widely seen as a subtle jab at his father's traditional style, yet North Point exploded in growth. By the end of its first year, it had 4,000 members. Today, it reaches over 43,000 across multiple locations. It became one of the largest churches in the U.S., built without any help from Charles Stanley. The father led one of the world's most influential ministries. The son built one of the biggest churches in America. But they were completely estranged. Their silence became symbolic of everything wrong with modern evangelical leadership to men preaching grace, but struggling to offer it to each other. They eventually began counseling, trying to rebuild what had been lost. Andy once asked the counselor, "When do I give up on my dad?" The response, "When your heavenly Father gives up on you." That moment hit hard. Slowly, they started talking. One lunch changed everything. Charles told Andy, "I don't want us to end up like all those other fathers and sons." Andy replied, "Me neither, Dad." It was a beginning. By 2013, Andy's North Point Church had grown into a religious juggernaut. Charles Stanley, the man who had once felt abandoned by his son, now stood in his pulpit and publicly praised him. It was a powerful moment. This was the same Charles who had once taken subtle jabs at Andy during sermons, but now he was proud. He even blessed Andy's plans for new church campuses. Privately, Charles admitted the words didn't come easily, but he said them anyway. That blessing changed their relationship forever. They didn't just start speaking again, they began preaching at each other's churches. The father, who once saw his son as a rival, now saw him as a trusted leader. Andy had spent his life watching Charles command stages with fiery sermons, but now it was his turn. Charles's era was ending, but his legacy continued through his son. As Charles aged, he spent most of his time in a large leather chair, his body frail, but his mind still sharp. Andy visited often. Each time they'd sit together, talk and pray. Charles would always ask, "Pray for me." Those visits became sacred. That chair became a symbol of peace, a place where a broken bond was slowly healed through prayer and presence. On Saturday, April 15, 2023, Andy visited his father one last time. He expected their usual routine, kneel beside the chair, pray, and say goodbye. But this time, Charles asked, "Can I pray for you?" It was the only time he'd done that. Andy didn't know it then, but those were his father's final words. To him, "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." On April 18, 2023, Charles Stanley passed away peacefully at 7:30 a.m. He was 90 years old. His ministry, which began when he was just 14, had lasted over 7 decades. For 66 years, he preached. For 50 of those, he led First Baptist Atlanta. In 2020, he stepped down, becoming pastor emeritus. But his work didn't end. In Touch Ministries continued to grow. His daughter, Becky Stanley Brorson, didn't speak publicly often, but she witnessed the highs and lows. She saw the toll the divorce took, but she stayed close. She was there in the final chapter. Today, In Touch Ministries broadcasts in 114 languages, reaching people in 150 countries. It started as the Chapel Hour in 1972 and became a global force. Even in remote areas, thanks to satellite technology, people heard Charles Stanley preach. His voice is now preserved forever in digital archives. Charles Stanley's life was full of contradictions. He preached about family, yet lost his own. He taught healing but had to learn how to do it himself. Raised by an alcoholic stepfather, he developed a survival instinct that made him a powerful leader, but also a hard man to live with. That complexity didn't weaken his message, it made it real. His story is one of success, failure, redemption, and healing. Charles Stanley didn't live a perfect life, but he left behind a legacy that touched millions. Through his sermons, his pain, and ultimately his peace with his son, he showed that faith isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. In the end, it wasn't the crowds, the TV ratings, or the global reach that defined him. It was the quiet moment in a leather chair, whispering one final prayer for the son who once walked away, but always found his way back. Even though Charles Stanley is no longer with us, his influence still lives on, not just through television or radio, but in the hearts of those he helped. Many people who never met him in person still felt a connection to him, whether it was a single sermon that gave them hope during hard times, or a daily devotional that helped them make it through the week. Charles was more than just a preacher. He became a spiritual companion to millions. His words comforted people battling cancer, parents struggling to raise kids, and young adults trying to find their purpose. In the lonely corners of the world, his voice brought peace. That kind of influence can't be measured just in numbers or views. It's found and changed lives. He also trained a generation of pastors who carry his teachings forward. Many of them came from broken homes themselves, just like he did. They saw in Charles a man who didn't let his painful past define his future. He showed that God can use anyone no matter where they come from. This gave hope to leaders who were unsure if they could handle the pressure of ministry or the weight of personal failure. Charles wasn't perfect, and he didn't try to hide that. That honesty made him relatable. It's easy to admire someone's strengths, but it's more powerful to learn from their struggles. Today, both of Charles Stanley's children, Andy and Becky, continue to honor his memory in different ways. Andy preaches every week, 2000s. of people, while his methods are more modern and his approach more conversational. He still carries the heart of his father's message: love, truth, and grace. When Andy speaks about forgiveness or healing, you can feel the weight of what he personally went through. And when people ask him about his father, he often responds not with stories about fame, but about quiet moments, prayers, advice, and deep personal conversations. Those are the memories that stay with him. Becky, though not a public figure like her brother, often speaks about her father's warmth and his deep belief in prayer. In interviews, she describes how Charles would wake up early just to spend time with God. She says he never made a decision, big or small, without first praying. That discipline, she says, shaped how their family learned to trust God, even when things were painful. Through both Andy and Becky, Charles's life continues to ripple outward, touching more people with each passing year. Charles Stanley's story reminds us that no life is without scars. But scars don't have to stop us. In fact, they can become the very thing God uses to reach others. From a young boy in rural Virginia who lost his father too soon, to a global preacher whose voice reached millions, Charles showed that faith isn't about being flawless, it's about being faithful. His teachings weren't built on high-sounding theology, but on daily obedience and deep trust. He didn't just talk about forgiveness, he had to live it, especially when rebuilding a relationship with his son. Even now, long after his last sermon, people still watch his videos, read his books, and listen to his voice for guidance. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of all: not buildings, awards, or broadcast deals, but a simple message that still speaks: God loves you. He hasn't given up on you. And no matter how broken things may seem, there's always a way back.